There were many popes involved in the decision-making during the design and construction of the new St. Peter's Basilica. They were all intent on throwing out the old barbaric French way of architecture and reestablishing the Roman and Hellenistic culture, in part by using the classic vocabulary in Christendom's most important church. The Christian theologian Thomas Aquinas, born in 1225 and died in 74, was heavily influenced by an earlier Christian theologian, Augustine of Hippo, born in 354 and died in 430. Aquinas was largely responsible for bringing the thinking of the ancient Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, and others, into Roman Christianity. The classical temple facades that appeared during the Renaissance and later periods are the obvious manifestations of this new classical thinking. So with the rebirth of Greek and Roman thinking, what is to become of the Gothic Christian mysticism as a man-centered rationalism begins to take hold of Western Christianity?
Okay, welcome to the next presentation on 2,000 years of Western Christian architecture on the Renaissance, which I call the ancient Greeks leave a Trojan horse in Rome. Let's begin. I want to go back in time a little bit, well, not a little bit, to Plato. And the Christians were influenced by the Greeks, and I'll explain a little bit how that happened. But they knew about these Greek philosophers and were not ignorant of the Greeks. But there was a turnabout in what we now call the Renaissance about how mankind saw itself or in Christianity. And what they were looking for is truth, beauty, and goodness. And there was an interesting quote I came across by Plato, and it says, "Love is a serious mental disease." And it has nothing to do with architecture, but I was just surprised that he would have said that. So let's do the timeline for the Renaissance quickly. We're going to start on the left side over here with, at the beginning of the Renaissance, roughly around 350. This overlaps with the late Gothic. And what we have in the Renaissance is a Greek-Roman architectural revival that goes for about 500 years or so. And it's actually still going on. And then it distorts into the Mannerist and then becomes really distorted into the Baroque and Rococo periods. And then we're going to finish up at the end of that. And what happens there is we end up in the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, which happens between 1517 and 1642. And also at the beginning of the Renaissance, we have the Avignon papacy, the Babylonian captivity from 1309 to 1378. And this is a continuation or a buildup of this continuing French-Italian animosity, which I think is very much behind or not appreciated in how the Renaissance happened. And then one very important event happened in 1453, and that's Sultan Mehmed II's successful siege and capture of the city of Constantinople. And so the Eastern Roman Empire falls to Islam, and a lot of many of the learned priests and clergy and teachers migrated to the West, including Rome, of course, and that had a big influence on leaving the Gothic and proceeding into the Renaissance. These Eastern Roman persons were obviously very familiar, had extensive libraries, and they were very familiar with the Greeks and the Arab, as well as the Hindu mathematicians. So that brought a major change also. Oh, and the other thing is, put an asterisk over Renaissance, is a philosophical assault on the medieval world. The emphasis became on individualism in the world of art. We can become what we will. That's a quote from an Italian philosopher. And that's important to keep in mind, that now we feel that we can be what we want to be. It didn't all happen by the throw of a switch, but it was gradual in moving in that direction. And how that happened is we have Alexander the Great here on the left, and his teacher was Aristotle. So the ancient Greeks, Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato, and others were imbued in Alexander as a young man. And then, of course, he went on his crusades, and the ancient Greek philosophy and language was spread across the Hellenistic world by Alexander's conquest. And I think that probably explains a lot to do with Paul of Tarsus, or Saul of Tarsus, knowing Greek and considered to be an educated man, because he knew Greek, and that was a language of the educated people in the Levant and in the Mediterranean basin. And that had to do with Alexander the Great's education under the Greek philosopher Aristotle. And so what happens is individual liberty and religious tolerance in opposition to an absolute monarchy and fixed dogma of the church is starting to take place. And reason, and this word will come up time and time again in the next couple of weeks, is the primary source of authority and legitimacy. And so there's this tug between the church as being the authority and the church as being the church. And they're starting to understand through the ancient Greeks that there's other ways of looking at the world. And you'll see this reason become manifest in the French Revolution in 1789 after that, when they take Notre Dame and call it the Temple to Reason after the French Revolution. So it eventually does cancel out the church and become reason as the primary source of authority and legitimacy. In this very famous painting of the School of Athens by Raphael, we have Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right. And these other figures in here are famous from that period also. Okay, so Aristotle and Ptolemy they were both proponents of this geocentric universe where the Earth is the center. But there was a scientific revolution starting to take place from Copernicus to Newton, about 1550 to 1700. And that is the use of reason to find the truth. And here's the Ptolemaic model where Earth is the center and the sun revolves around, and the Copernicus model where the sun is the center and the Earth and the moon revolve around it. But Copernicus was under great pressure, under threat of communication, and I think even death. And he said, in the way he kind of, and I want to say weaseled out of this, but if this happened to me, I'd be scared as well. And he probably produced this saying under some duress. And he said, "It is my loving duty to seek the truth in all things insofar as God has granted that to human reason." In other words, it wasn't up to God. I could never have reasoned this out. So please forgive me in a way. But as we know, that Copernicus started probably the scientific revolution. This drawing by Leonardo da Vinci in 1490 is very famous. It's called The Vitruvian Man. And it's based on a series of books, De Architectura, written by a Roman architect named Vitruvius. He existed from around 80 BC to about 15 AD. And what he's talking about is the perfect proportions of architecture and the human body. So this idea of divine proportion in man and how that can be applied to architecture. And we'll get into that right now. The medieval mind saw God's creation as a harmonious whole. The Renaissance developed the split of mind and body, as known as dualism. That was René Descartes, early 17th century, and the creation of doubt in teachings of the Bible. And that wasn't Descartes per se, but that was what was starting to happen. There's a creation of doubt in the Bible. If the sun revolves around the earth and that's not really what's happening, then what else is at fault or incorrect? And so we get a gradual shift from the glory of God, Christian humanism, to the glory of man, which is Renaissance humanism, where man was created in the image of God. And I think that creates some interesting problems that still exist today. transitioning from a religious-based society to a people-based society in the spirit of skepticism, interest in logic and reason over faith, and a greater concern for the individual, for freedom and the dignity of man. And what happens is an interest in cultural achievement and fulfillment is in this world. These are my words. God becomes an old white-haired man that by definition must have a place somewhere in the universe. And I think that came out of the Renaissance. And of course, we're all familiar with that Sistine Chapel painting of God and Adam, with the fingers that almost touch. And there in full glory is God as a white-haired old man. And if you're a white-haired old man, you've got to be somewhere in the universe. And that may or may not be where God is. And I think when you start looking at God as a human-like figure that has to be somewhere in the universe, you start working your way into a box that may be a little bit difficult to get out of in an explanation of the mystical sense of who and what God is. And then we have secularism, which eventually takes over, the separation of religion from civic affairs and the state. That happens later at the end of the Renaissance, but nevertheless, this is where the seeds are planted. And most importantly is man is the measure of all things. And this is a quote from the ancient Greek philosopher Protagoras. Man is the measure of all things, and that's what this drawing by Da Vinci is all about, and how that is applied. These rules of proportion are applied to the buildings. But I want to point out that the Renaissance was not anti-Christian. It became extremely anti-Christian in the French Revolution and some of the other subsequent revolutions, but not at this point. They were trying to work their way through the Bible and this discovery of the world using methods of reasoning that the Greeks had talked about. So let's start with this diptych, which I found fascinating. Both panels are painted at the same time by Jean Fouquet in the late Gothic period, early Renaissance period, called the Milan diptych, but they are in two separate museums now. By the magic of Photoshop, you can look at them together right now. And what's significant about this, on the left is a pretty realistic version of two human beings, and on the right we recognize that as the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus, but she is white, very white, and the background are cherubim and seraphim, which are not realistic, but they are blue and red, and they just happen to be the colors of the French flag, red, white, and blue. But more importantly is the sense of space. And if you look at the left, we're starting to see perspective come into play. The perspective has been discovered, and they were working on the use of perspective in their drawings and also in their architecture. I'll show you what they do to distort perspective for theatric effects in the Plaza of San Pietro, St. Peter's Plaza in front of the Vatican, in front of St. Peter's Church. So everything kind of goes off to the left on this off to the right on this left-hand panel. But on the right-hand panel, it all focuses on Mary's heart. And I think that's very much a Gothic idea. The space is very flat. There's no depth to it. Everything is like compressed, like back into that chair, and that's it. Jesus sits a little bit out using overlapping on Mary's lap, but it's basically flat. There's no perspective. And so in this diptych, you're seeing the transition from Gothic on the right to Renaissance on the left. In the Renaissance, generalizing here, it's arithmetic based. In the Gothic, it's geometric based. Obviously they did drawings in both of them. They started to rely on this golden means more so than they did in the Gothic period. There's a feeling of permanence in the Renaissance, and in Gothic, there's a feeling of transidence. And the Renaissance's concern is with the mundane and the worldly, and in the Gothic, it's otherworldly, and the word I've used before, and I'll use again, gauzy, where things are not crystal clear, they're not sharp edged, they're kind of in a different realm. In the Renaissance, the glory to God in man's image as the image of God, And in Gothic period, it was glory to God in the world of spirit. All things in God's creation were imbued with spirit. Now God's creation is imbued in the image of man. And so truth, beauty, and goodness was achieved through reason. And on the right is a study of Platonic solids using mathematics to discover the truth, the truth, the truth, the truth. That's what they felt they were trying to discover, and they did that through the use of reason. And let me take you through this idea of the golden ratio or golden means using a drawing and mathematics. The golden ratio it starts with a square, and you divide the bottom half of the square and draw a diagonal to the upper right-hand corner, and then swing an arc down, extend the bottom over to the end of the arc. And you have A is to A plus B as 1 is to 1.618. So that is the system of divine proportion, that 1.618 and that 1 to 1.618. And that starts to be a controlling feature for a lot of architecture in the Renaissance, as well in the Gothic period. They didn't leave evidence of that in the Gothic period as they did in the Renaissance. And so another way of seeing that is with the golden ratio called the Fibonacci series. And that means that 1 plus 1 equals 2 and 1 plus 2 equals 3. In other words, you add the next number to the sum of the ones before it. So then you get 1 plus 2 is 3, 3 plus 2 here is 5, 5 plus 3 is 8. You can keep going around with this and expanding it as you go by using the Fibonacci series. It was well known, developed during the Renaissance and well known. And so this magic golden ratio is something it felt it was divine. It came from the divine, and it was applied to many, many different aspects of life. And one of those is not on here is music, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. And I know less about music than I do philosophy, but I hope there will be enough for you to figure it out on your own. Okay, so the golden ratio applied to the Parthenon. And you can see that the height to the pediment, top of the pediment, this has been blown away. So the top of the pediment, that length, that vertical to the horizontal is in the ratio of 1.618. So the Greeks knew about it. They knew about it in the medieval period, and it came really back to life in a very important way in the Renaissance. And about music, it's interesting. I just find this thing. Remember the Fibonacci series. There are 13 notes in the span of any note through its octave. The scale is comprised of 8 notes, of which the 5th and 3rd notes create the basic foundation of all chords and are based on the whole tone, which is 2 steps from the root tone. That is the first note of the scale. I don't understand all what that means, but note 2, how the piano keyboard of C to C above has, of 13 keys, has 8 white keys, 5 black keys, and is split into groups of 3 and 2. That's interesting because that whole, what you see, whenever you look at a keyboard now, it's all in the relation, it's all a Fibonacci series. And that is taken into the division of the divine proportions of man made in God's image. For example, A to B, or the height of a head from chin to top of head, is in the ratio of B to D is to A to B. This ratio here, the navel to the chin, is in the golden ratio of the chin to the top of the head. And these are different places on the body where top of the head to the navel to the feet is also in the golden ratio. Okay, so this is some of the things we see in nature. This was felt it was a divine proportion. And so what they were able to do is if you take one of these squares and put a compass point at the corner and draw an arc from corner to corner, then move to the next one and draw another arc, put a compass point here and draw an arc, another arc, you get what is known as a Fibonacci spiral. And then somebody takes it and puts it on Mona Lisa's nose, and you see that her top of her head to her chin works out. But this is also, so I think there's a danger in doing this. I don't know what this ratio means right here, but anyway, you'll see a lot of misapplications of this theory after the fact, but we do know that some of the artists did use this and use it successfully to create harmonious sculpture, paintings, and architecture. And it occurs in nature. Here's the Fibonacci spiral in a nautilus shell, in sunflower seeds, how they spiral out, pine cones. Here's a hurricane, and then presidential hairdo. And then how this really became embedded in Christian thinking and in our architecture is Augustine of Hippo. He was baptized in 386 AD, became a devout Christian. The heavenly city outshines Rome, and there instead of victory is truth. And so what he did is he adapted ancient classical Greek thought to Christian teaching. He laid the foundations for much of medieval and modern Christian theology. And then we have St. Thomas of Aquinas. He picked up on what Augustine of Hippo said. So we have Plato to Aristotle, to Alexander the Great, to Augustine of Hippo, to Thomas Aquinas, ancient Greek to Christian theology. And he produced a comprehensive synthesis of Christian theology and Aristotelian philosophy that influenced Roman Catholic doctrine for centuries and was adopted as the official philosophy of the church in 1917. So Augustine of Hippo and Thomas Aquinas are very instrumental in merging Christianity and Greek philosophy. So let's look at the first building. This is a building, this is the Florence Cathedral, the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore. It's in Florence, and this is a bell tower, which is very Italian. The French and English didn't do this normally. This part was built in the Gothic period. And I have a couple things I want to mention about that. If you notice, there's no flying buttresses. This is a very patterned, purposeful design facade. Everything is a pattern probably worked out on these divine proportions and so forth. Unlike the French Gothic buildings where the outside was a diagram of overcoming forces that were allowing the building to stand up, the flying buttresses, the step buttressing, the pointed arch. Here, none of that is apparent. It is, the Italians had a completely different approach to this. There is none of that unnecessary, quote unquote, structural stuff out here. It's their idea of what a building should be. So let's take a look at it. This is a famous dome. There's actually an interesting book called Brunelleschi's Dome if you want to read about how this thing came to be. It was, the building itself was started in 1296 and not finished until 1471. And it was, there was wars intervening which slowed it down, but there was a problem, is they had this massive octagonal space you can see here with no dome over it. And they didn't know how to build a dome. It's 180 feet from corner to corner. It's like, well, here's a good idea for a building, but I don't know how to put a roof on it. But they had this competition, and Brunelleschi came up with double dome, which became the way domes are built through the 19th century. The US Capitol is a double cast iron dome, for example. There's no flying buttresses. You can see it in the plan. There's no buttresses along the wall. So how did they keep it from falling over? Well, the dome became what Brunelleschi proposed was pretty amazing, is the drum was there, and then they started to build, and they started at 1422. That's how far they made it in 4 years. Then 1439, and they topped out where the base and lantern goes in 14 1436, put the lantern on and the oculus, and in 1471, 374 feet above the ground, they topped off the lantern with a cross. But this dome is, in structure, is hidden. They're making their best guesses is how this dome stands up. It's not a dome like we've been talking about, where you take an arch and spin it, but it's these arches like flying buttresses but are not half arches. They're like pieces, and they all go together in this compression ring at the top, and so they all push against each other, but they still have a problem of the load in pushing outward. And so what they did here is they use these vertical brick arches. There's evidently like 1 million or so, and they're custom made bricks for their particular location in this dome. And then they used a wood tension ring. Wood is equally strong in tension and compression, but it's not very strong regardless. But they put these wood tension rings in to try to keep this outward thrust from destroying the dome. And they also put in these interlocking stone grillages to resist the dome's outward thrust. You can see them here. And they put reinforcing these pieces of massive stone, carved massive stone at the corners to help brace it. And it worked. That's absolutely amazing. You can see the section through the cathedral here, and you can see the two shells of the dome. So this is what the double dome plan looks like. It's a 3-aisle quadripartite vault. The Italians did it differently than the French. The French would have made the side aisle square and then made the crossing vault in the nave rectangular. The Italians made the crossing vault square and the side aisles rectangular. This to me looks like it might be a candidate for the golden ratio, but nevertheless, it's a 3-aisle basilical form. There's no flying buttresses along the side, but what they did do, they put tie rods in across the nave and across the side aisles, keep it from pushing out. In other words, these are strong iron tensile members rather than compressive flying buttresses. The French would have never tolerated messing up the interior like that. It didn't bother the Italians. The Italians were more concerned about the outside, not more concerned, but they were concerned about the outside appearance as well. Not that the French weren't. We now have this rebirth of pagan architecture, it seems. And so let's take a look at the components so you know what we're looking at. We're looking at the Parthenon here. The base of it's called the stylobate. There's columns, and there's an entablature that the columns support. And remember, these columns are close together because this stone is weak in tension. If you took this column out and made that one piece of limestone or marble, it would collapse. It wouldn't be strong enough to span that whole distance. So that's why you see this column so close together. And then we have the pediment, this triangle above the entablature. What is famous about the Parthenon's pediment, it's full of these beautiful sculptures called the Elgin marbles. And the Greeks want them back, and the Brits say, yeah, no, we've got them, and we're not going to give them back to you. It's not a happy point between the Brits and the Greeks. Brits felt they saved them from destruction or theft, and the Greeks want them back. So here we are today with another problem. Entablature contains stone lintels spanning between columns. And like I said, they're closely spaced because of the tension in the bottom of the lintels in limestone and marble. And this is important. The pagan temple form was not proportionally correct in terms of, if you look at the height to the width, in terms of the golden means, it was not proportionally correct for a large basilica building. Therefore, the pagan temple form became a thin veneer. And I'll show you what I mean by that. Often in multiple layers, cloaking the traditional Christian basilical form. We keep going back to that original Constantine basilical form, and it's now reemerging, but cloaked in pagan temple form. Columns have a vocabulary of their own that I want to introduce to you. They're anthropomorphic. There's feet, which is called the base. There's a body, which is called the shaft. And there's a head, which is called the capital. So the base, the shaft, and the capital correspond to the human feet, the body, and the head. And these are the five orders, the traditional orders of classical architecture: Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and that's in chronological order. And then lastly is a composite, which is usually the Ionic and the Corinthian. If you want to go see them locally, I believe the Supreme Court has composite capitals. Tuscan capital, very simple. Doric, simple. Ionic, volute. Corinthian, acanthus leaves, stylized. And then composite, it's usually Ionic and Corinthian combined. And these are the five orders of Greek and Roman architecture. You notice that these columns have fluting in them. Tuscans didn't. The Romans normally didn't flute their columns. And if you look carefully, these columns are not entirely parallel. They're wider here than they are up here. And this slight bulging here and here and here, it's called entasis, and that is to optically correct so that the columns do look straight. The Romans, they polished their columns and didn't flute them normally. So if you see a building with smooth columns, it's taken from Roman vocabulary, and if it's fluted, it's usually a Greek vocabulary. And so I want to talk about the Trojan horse that the Greeks left in Rome. And the manifestation of this rebirth was the use of the Greek-Roman temple fronts on Christian church facades. The architects began to layer and distort temple facades. This was the beginning of the Mannerist period of art during the Renaissance. That's where the Renaissance, these specific rules started to get stretched and pulled to try to adapt these temple fronts to these Christian churches. And this is, of course, the mothership of all. So I'm going to spend a little time on that. And so the way they did this is they multi-layered the church. If you look at that kind of a pinkish rectangle, it doesn't look like it's in the golden means, but if you divide it in half, it might be two golden means end to end. I'm not sure, but it is a temple front. And then on top of that, in this darker pink, it steps out another temple front. And then stepping out again is another temple front. And stepping out again is the final temple front, which is the main entrance to St. Peter's, and it has a pediment. And you'll see the stylobate down here, the entablature, the pediment, and the columns. But these being in multi-layers, they're trying to make a elegantly proportioned building, and I think they did. So you ask yourself, what's all this stuff going on up here? This is called an attic, but certainly changes the overall proportion here, and it allows some more iconography. St. Peter's in Rome. Okay, so there's the pediment, and that's called the attic, that big piece up there. And that changes the proportion. It's very purposeful. All right, so this is how St. Peter's came to be. Here's old St. Peter's. It's five-aisle basilica. We've seen this before, and the tomb of St. Peter's is right below. This is a Constantine basilica modified over the ages. One of these walls inside was like 7 feet out of plumb, and it was going to fall down, so they decided to take the whole thing down. I believe there's either 5 or 7 popes involved in, from the teardown of old St. Peter's to the completion of new St. Peter's. So this is the first plan by an architect named Bramante in 1506. Oh, you can see the cruciform plan, the Latin cross. And now we have a Greek cross. And so what's going on here is this was a liturgical basilica asked to be a martyrial basilica. Now they want it to be a martyrial basilica by putting a dome over the tomb of St. Peter's. So where this is will go here after they tear the building down. That's the tomb. This red dot represents the tomb of St. Peter's. And it's a Greek plan, equilateral legs on the cross, and capped by the dome of heaven. Same thing with Michelangelo's plan. What he did was he took a square and then he took another square and rotated the second square 45 degrees, heavied up the piers for this big dome, and put a colonnade on the front. So it did have a temple-like front. As we went from pope to pope, they decided that that's really not what they wanted. This is the Moderno plan. Here it's a cruciform plan, the dome of heaven above, but they didn't leave it at Michelangelo plan. You can see here something's been added. And they added 2 more bays of bare vaulted nave to make it a Latin cross plan again. So we're back to the Latin cross. It's a martyrial basilica capped by the dome of heaven. And it's a return to Roman round arches and a round vault, nothing pointed, no flying buttresses. And then the narthex is extended to give it a more majestic presence on the plaza. And so it evolves from a liturgical basilica to a martyrial basilica, marking the grave martyred St. Peter under a dome. This is the aerial view of it. Rome is over here, the Tiber River's here, and this is the approach to Rome. Here's St. Peter's Square, and here is St. Peter's, there's the dome. And this plan up here is 3 plans superimposed, one in sequence, the Circus of Nero, which was here before the old St. Peter's, then in the darker black is old St. Peter's, and then in the lighter gray is new St. Peter's as it exists today. And this is what happened. This is the Circus of Nero, and the Egyptian witness obelisk to St. Peter's martyrdom was right here in the center of the racetrack. And this is thought to be the probable location of St. Peter's martyrdom right here. And it's said that the last thing he saw on this earth is the witness obelisk. Here's old St. Peter's plan. The approach from Rome, this is very important because the apse faces west. It's the only major Christian church I know of where the apse does not face east or southeast to Jerusalem. They felt it was important that to be accepted in Constantine's time that this major basilica be approachable and directly from Rome. And so to this day, it's backwards. So instead of getting the morning sun, you get crepuscular twilight. That means sun comes in from the west in the evening. And so the lighting is all backwards in here from a normal church. There's the tomb of St. Peter. And you can see if you put a pin in that the old St. Peter's and the new St. Peter's are all located about that tomb, oriented to Rome. And so that's what really determines the site plan. There's the plan of St. Peter's with the tomb and the dome of heaven right here. Approach from Rome. And this is the Bernini colonnade. It's a Baroque oval, and a little bit we'll get to the Baroqueness of an oval and why that's important. But you'll see what Bernini does with this. We have that extended facade, the narthex right here. And what Bernini does, instead of putting this colonnade parallel like most people would have done, he distorts the perspective to increase the grandeur of St. Peter's. In other words, he pushes the ends inward so that it works backwards in perspective. Instead of accentuating the perspective, he does it this way. So when you look down that, you'll see the sides of the colonnade, but it pulls St. Peter's closer to you visually. So it's one of those tricks they love to do in the Baroque period. And I forgot that I was going to mention that I think this is probably based on this drawing. This is about where St. Peter might have been martyred, based on the edge of the of St. Peter's right here, and you see that edge is right here, and that's, if these plans are correct, that might have been where he was martyred. But anyway, these here are the colonnade is delivered to distort the perspective, very much a Baroque idea, and you can see this massive building comes forward as these colonnades look almost parallel, but they're not. You want to put them as parallel in your mind, which makes St. Peter's move forward. And this is the Bernini colonnade. If you've been there, I'm sure you've noticed it. It's beautiful. And this is the witness obelisk. And this is the dome. In St. Peter's, it's a double dome. This is the assembly diagram. There is the drum. We go over the pendentive. We talked about that before. The squinch. Squinch is my favorite word in the whole architectural lexicon. Just fun to say, squinch. But that's an older version of how to make a transition from a square to a round dome. They use the pendentives much more elegantly. So we're looking at pendentives on this drawing as well as these two diagrams. The drum, the rib dome, and the lantern, and the oculus, the whole inner dome to let light in from the lantern down in. So there was a problem. You'll see at the end of this drawing, before it goes, there'll be 3 chains that were put in originally. Again, they were using tension instead of using, like they did in Hagia Sophia, they used half domes around or quarter domes to push back on the spring line of these domes. So what happened was they put a lot of masonry in, and then they put some chains. Well, the chains didn't hold too well. They got cracking. And so in 1743, you can see this is built over this period of time. So they're looking at 100 years later, they need some more reinforcing. Then in 1744, they added 3 more chains hidden in the masonry. And then in 1748, they added the final chain, I think, and that did finally stabilize the dome. And those are the location of the 3 original chains. So you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 chains. Those are all in tension to keep the dome from expanding out at the base and collapsing in. And this is the inside view of it. You see the pendentives, the oculus, the rib dome, and the lantern, and the drum. And this is the inside of that dome in detail. These are 16 figures from the Bible. Christ the Redeemer is number 8, but I want you to look at each one of these panels closely. Each one is sectioned off in a frame, so to speak, and the images are within that frame. You see, it's all pretty neat and tidy. Every one of these is in its own place, and it's very, very conventionally displayed. Keep that in mind. Okay, so this is a picture of the interior. I want to talk about the baldachin or baldacchino a little bit, because this marks St. Peter's tomb, which I have 3 drawings below. This is a plan. His grave was destroyed over here. This is the surviving part. This is known as the Red Wall. I've never been down there. I'd love to see it. This is a section looking from this direction going this way. And these 2 pieces, these plinths right here, are these plinths up here in this photograph to give you an idea of the scale of this. And here is the surviving part of St. Peter's grave, which you see in the plan here. And this is an elevation of that whole thing. So this is the present floor of the Basilica of St. Peter's, and the high altar, which is this, which sits over his grave. It has 4 Solomonic twisted columns. This is by Bernini also, this piece of work. And these twisted columns come from biblical history. You can see it there in this photograph on the right. And then these 2 twisted columns are supposedly from the first temple in Jerusalem, Solomon's temple. And I think some studies have been done within the past 100 years that show that the rock that these twisted columns came from are Italian, I think, and probably not from the first temple, but some people still think it is. So how that from Solomon's time becomes this as part of Christianity is the beauty of it is just this continuum of history that goes back into the Bronze Age. And that's how they do it. And this is what I wanted to say. The basilica is wrapped with a Roman and Greek temple facade. It's really a three-aisle basilica. It has transepts, it has a nave, it has side aisles, and it has a dome at the crossing. And willing to say, and I'll show you in St. Paul's in just a minute, that you can peel this Roman pagan veneer off and you have almost have a Gothic church behind it. So this was really an attempt by the Italians to give credence to their history by taking the tried and proven basilical form and wrap it with their history. In this case, it's the Greek and Roman temples. So there was a big fire in London in 1666. And Christopher Wren was given the job to redesign St. Paul's and many other buildings. Parenthetically, Christopher Wren had designed a building in this country. It's on the campus of William and Mary. So any of you that are familiar with that campus are probably familiar with the Wren building. Very famous architect, very productive. So anyway, London burned, old St. Paul's disappeared, Christopher Wren built it. And look what we have. We have multiple temple fronts on a building with a dome of heaven over the crossing. And there it is. There's the apse, and it faces east-northeast. Here's the plan, the choir. There's the side aisle, transept, the nave. So it's not too far unlike a Roman basilica or Gothic cathedral. Those are two side chapels that are Baroque ovals. Put St. Paul's into the Baroque period, even though it's not, we're not into the Rococo yet in the Counter-Reformation, but it's a step between, I think, the Renaissance and the Reformation. So, and I want you to look at this thin veneer around here. And I'll show you what's interests me about this in a minute. Okay, so there's a Latin plan, the dome of heaven. And this is a triple dome. Here's one dome, two domes, and then the third dome here with a lantern. And that's looking up into the dome. It's a double dome here, and then the outside shell is the weatherproof part of it. And it's interesting, there's 8 pendentives here. And if I go back to the plan for just a second, you can see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 entrances into this dome circle. And so that's why there are 8 pendentives here. And the vaulting is round, it's not pointed. The arches are also round. So this is definitely not a Gothic church, but it follows the Basilica plan. But they cheat, and I'll tell you why they cheat. Here's a closer look of the top. And if you look right here, here, and here, and the same along here, you'll see, I think, and I'm pretty sure they're flying buttresses. So they took a Gothic church, and then look how thin this is. This is the stone temple front all around here. I'd like to have one of those excavators, those claws, and just walk around this building with it and pull this stuff off, you know. And you could see that it's really a Gothic church. Quit hiding it, you know. Be proud of your Gothic heritage, England. So it's a three-aisled Gothic basilica form cloaked in a thin veneer of Greco-Roman temple facades. And to me, it's a Gothic sheet masquerading as a Roman temple of reason to be
What
contemporary.
remains of medieval mysticism has given way to a more neat and orderly view of the saints, the Trinity, and other Christian icons. That is, until St. Ignatius and the Jesuits come into the scene, capitalizing on the exuberance of the Baroque and Rococo periods of art to reestablish another type of mystical church interior. This time, instead of using stained glass as a transient device, the Italians again looked to France as they employed paint, plaster, and sculpture in a manner known as le trompe-l'oeil, meaning to fool the eye. Leaving the well-ordered Christian Renaissance behind, let's take a look at this new form of creating a mystical experience for worshipers of the Christian faith, the fantastic church interiors of the Baroque and Rococo periods.